How's it going, Austin? Thank you very much for joining me.
No problem. How are you, Jan?
Pretty good, thanks. I finished the book there yesterday. I did the audio book. Really good reading of it. That was you, wasn't it?
The odd, I did the audiobook myself. It took about 4.5 days or so to do it. It was it was difficult for someone that's never done something like that before. But it was an experience to do it, and I saw the benefit of having the bite-sized chapters when I was because originally when I wrote the book, I wrote it in 10 chapters, and it's like kind of like about 9,000 words a chapter, which is what I been kind of advised to do. And then a journalist looked at it with me and he said, "Look, I think if we split these chapters in two and make smaller bite-sized chapters, because people if they listen to an and in the audiobook, they're just say going down to the shops, or if you're somebody that likes to read in the bed at night time, you can just read a small bite-sized chapter, put it aside, and pick it up again.
Okay, so t take us into your growing up. What year were you born?
So I was born in 1968, in August 1968. My parents had married in September 67. So um, at that time, my dad, he joined the prison service in 1959, and he would have spent maybe a year or so in Mountjoy in Dublin before he came back to Portlaoise. And, it was a peculiar time because the state in Ireland were shutting down all the county prisons at the time. So after independence, Ireland would have been left with, say, a prison in Dundalk, a prison in Carlow, a prison in Tullamore, prison in Mullingar, prison in Portlaoise, and this we just didn't have prisoners in the country. It was that simple. Ireland was a very, I suppose, quaint place, and there was very little crime. And they went on a whole mission of shutting down prisons. And what you had left in Ireland when my father joined the prison service in 1959 was basically Cork, Limerick, Portlaoise, Arbor Hill, Mountjoy, and what was St. Patrick's Institution in Clonmel at the time, and then the female prison in Mountjoy. And they closed St. Patrick's in Clonmel and moved it into the female prison in Mountjoy. And that was it. And he went to Portlaoise, and it was just a prison where there was just normal run-of-the-mill prisoners. And he wait on 1973 got a promotion to assistant chief officer, and I remember my mother saying that's the first rung on the promotional ladder in the prison service. And my mother said, like, from 1959 to 1973, that was the first promotional opportunity that he had, because there just wasn't promotions. There were so few prisons, which meant that in effect there wasn't as many promotions either. And he had to go to Cork for that promotion in 1973. And in the meantime, the troubles were at kicking off, and they were at spilling across the border. And IRA prisoners obviously were at the time were kept in the D wing in Mountjoy. Um, and then you had the famous escape with the helicopter from Mountjoy. And at that stage, the state decided they needed a more secure environment. And when my dad was down in Cork between 73 and he was in Cork between 73 and 76, and then was in Limerick 76 to 77 and came back to Portlaoise in 77. And by the time he got back to Portlaoise, it was now a maximum security prison and one of the more secure prisons in Europe at the time. But you still, at that time, had a couple of escape attempts. You had the 19 guys getting out. You also had another escape attempt where an IRA prisoner was shot by a ricochet by an army guy that shot over his head. So there had been a couple of attempted escapes, and essentially, my dad um, was promoted to chief officer quite quickly after he got back to Portlaoise. And there's two grades of chief officer, a chief class one and a chief class two. And he was chief class two pretty quickly, and then he was chief officer class one within a year of that. So from about 79, he was the chief class one, which meant he was head of security. And he was in an environment where the IRA were essentially trying to, they consider themselves prisoners of war, and they considered it their duty to escape. Um, and they would have been bringing Semtex guns, mock uniforms into the prison, and it's basically his job was to try and stop them escaping and to keep the prison secure. And in his tenure there was no escapes. There was no attempted escapes. And the problem for I suppose for us as a family and for my dad was that he was probably too good at his job, and that's why he became a target. We know that he was working on something. That's what he told my mother. He told two particular prison officers came to me and said that they had been held back. He held back a tight knit group of guys to look for a weapon. He knew there was a gun in the prison, and this was in the weeks before he was shot. And the by all accounts, he had approached the governor and told the governor that he knew this gun was in the prison. Um, there's also Semtex found in one of the workshops in about a month before he was shot, and there's also this, and it has been backed up, I suppose, by again when I was doing my research, he was changing the lock on a particular gate. It was the last gate that the prisoners would have needed to get through before they got to the main gate. And he had information that the guy that was directly above him, the deputy governor, was basically copying keys for that gate and giving it to the IRA. And he would change the lock once a month on that gate. And also, if he had got information that they were now in possession of a key, he would again change it. He had an informant within the IRA that was telling him stuff. Um, and if we were going on 2 weeks holidays, he would only go on 1 week with us. He'd come the second week. But um, after the IRA had their attempted escape in I think it was February 85, they waited until my dad was dead because they didn't know the escape that they were planning. They didn't know what his mental condition was when he was survived the shooting. And they waited till after he was dead to effect that escape attempt. And the IRA newspaper on Public, when they were doing a kind of I think it was a 21-year commemoration of that escape in on Public, they actually talk about the fact that they had the keys to that gate. And it kind of backed up the information that I was getting from my own sources, that the IRA people themselves actually backed that up with what the stories they told about having the keys to that gate. So that would have been the background as to, you have to remember too the type of people that were in Portlaoise at the time. Very, very hardened terrorists, people that thought nothing of shooting the guards. People that would have shot guards. Um, I'm thinking of a couple of particular instances that were quite gruesome, where unarmed guards would have come across bank robberies or and given chase, and for guys to shoot them and stand over them and give put another bullet into them as they're lying on the ground. There was kind of no need for that. And like, so it gives you the mindset of the type of individual that was in Portlaoise at the time, I suppose. That these just weren't ordinary run-of-the-mill criminals. And people sometimes say to me, as to know they had a cause, and they were, they saw themselves as an army, and they had to stick to the regulations, but they had their green book, and their green book was quite explicit that they were not to engage with um, security forces from the south, and they did that on numerous occasions. Like, I mean, the record is there to speak. The IRA in particular murdered six Gardaí. They murdered an army man. They murdered my dad. And I'm aware that the operation to murder my dad was sanctioned at quite a high level, and I know that there was at least six high-ranking IRA men in the National Stadium, or the vicinity of the National Boxing Stadium in Dublin the night that my dad died, or was shot. So they they had rules, but did they stick to them?
I was gonna say it's worth mentioning the of all the Irish security forces and prison staff who were killed. I say, yeah, your father was the only Irish prison staff killed, but the Irish security forces, they only the ones that died were only due to Republicans. There's a kind of a grim irony that like loyalists didn't kill any. It was all Republican. another thing worth mentioning, yeah, I talk about collusion with like British security forces and loyalists a lot, but in fairness, there was plenty with various types of Irish security force, including like you mentioned prison staff. It must have been quite kind of chilling for you to find out later that your father was working with people who were actively colluding with the group who would kill him. Like,
Yeah, I certainly know of that individual, and the information I have is that that individual, while he would have been sympathetic, I also have my information is that he was being paid large sums of money as well. Um, I also know that there would have been at least two other individuals that I'm aware of in the prison at the time who were helping. Now, whether it was others with sympathies towards them, I certainly know that Martin Ferris in his authorized biography actually thanks the members of in the context when he talks about the escape attempt in 85, he actually thanks the sympathetic prison officers. And I actually said it to him at an Oireachtas committee on the Good Friday Agreement. I actually brought that up with him. And I actually said, look, I see from your book what you actually said, he also was quite nasty about my father in his book. And I had I just mentioned it to him at the Oireachtas committee here, and then he kind of just said to me, "Oh, well, I didn't write that book," but I said it was an authorized biography, and the quotes are direct quotes from you. Um, yeah, like there was a dirty war, insofar as that there would have been collusion on all sides. I think. I also know that. The British were running informants, but equally the Gardaí were running informants. And I certainly know that in my dad's case, the uh, the informant Sean O'Callaghan spoke to the Gardaí, and he gave the Gardaí a very good information about when the operation was planned to murder my dad. And it was done in a house just outside Portlaoise about 2 weeks before the operation. And he was able to give us the names of the individuals that were in the house that night. He told the Gardaí, and he said he was there himself. And I actually tracked Sean O'Callaghan down he was in the witness protection program at this stage, and I tracked him down, and he agreed to meet me, and I went to meet him, and I spent a whole day with him. And I he spoke to me for like 7 or 8 hours. And when I brought up that meeting, it was the only part of the meeting I think where his memory got a bit hazy. Now he had told the Gardaí a couple of months beforehand this was definitely where the operation was planned. What he said to me was, well, I don't know if it was the planning or the debrief after the operation. And I kind of knew where he was coming from because he knew Sean O'Callaghan was a very clever individual. And I knew his next question, he knew that my next question would be if he had to say to me that that's where the operation was planned, I was going to straight away ask him, well, did you not go with that information to the Gardaí as you were an informant at that stage? And then if he had to say, well, yeah, I did, but then I'm going to go to the Gardaí and say, what did you do about it? And then if he said, no, I didn't, then I was obviously going to say to him, well, were you playing God with my dad's life? So he was in a no-win situation. But he did tell the Gardaí in a statement that he was there in the house that night. He was very definitive with them, and then he kind of tried to wangle out of it a little bit but he said he was in the house at this meeting, whether it was the planning or debrief. He tried to just to water it down a little bit when I spoke to him.
just for anyone, and maybe for listeners in the UK not as familiar with Ireland, Portlaoise is like below Dublin even. So if you were to like divide the country in half, like sideways, it's even below that. It's nowhere near the border. It's not really it's not really anywhere that would be touched by the troubles as such. So
No,
yeah,
no.
worth mentioning that. Would you take us? Could you take us to the night he was shot? I guess not murdered yet, but yeah, could you take us to that, please?
But that night, the national senior finals were on, and we always went to the senior finals, the boxing senior finals, and it was the biggest night of the year in boxing. And my brother Oliver had just won the Leinster title a couple of weeks beforehand, and we were all geared up to go. And then my dad kind of said to us, "Look, I'm going with his friend Joe Ging, and Joe's driving, and there's three or four other lads coming in the car, and basically not room for you." And so we were kind of annoyed about that, and we were having a bit of a row with him in the house before he went because we weren't going to the boxing, and he headed off, and my mother dropped him down to Joe Ging's, and later on that my room was in the front of the house, and I could see car headlights coming down the driveway, and I was just kind of wondering what's going on here. But I just wasn't settled in the bed that night. I was uneasy. It was like I had this sixth sense there was something wrong. And I got up out of my bed, and it was probably sometime around midnight, and I went down to the front, down to the kitchen, and I went into the kitchen, and there was a man. We had a phone on the wall in the kitchen on the far left hand corner, and there was a guy on the phone with his back to me in a long trench coat on him, and I didn't recognize him at all. And I thought, God, this fella looks like a guard or something, you know. And then I saw my granny and my mother sitting on the couch, and my granny said to me, "Oh, your dad's been in an accident, Austin. He was hit by a motorbike crossing the road. Go back to bed, everything is okay." And then the guy on the phone turned around, and it was actually my uncle, and he was ringing Dublin to try and find out more information. So he took my mom up to Dublin, up to the hospital, and I went back to bed, but I knew there was something not right. And I sat up all night. This was at a time when the radio stations all finished up at kind of midnight. And I turned on Radio Luxembourg to see if there was anything on Radio Luxembourg, and there was nothing on that. So I waited until the first news. I sat up in the bed all night, waited until the first news came on when RT1 came back in at it was 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And I heard it then, they named my dad, and they said he was after being shot and that he was in a critical condition. And I got up out of my bed and I went down to the bedroom where my two younger brothers were. And I gathered them around me into the one bed and I told them what was after happening. And they didn't believe me. They thought I was joking with them. And I turned on the radio again and we waited for the next news bulletin to come along. And there it was on the news again. And with that, my granny came into the room. She heard us, and she kind of goes, "Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't hear it on the radio." And that's how we kind of found out. And my granny being was a bit of a stiff upper lip old soldier type, and she done what any good Irish granny would have done at the time. Frog marches down to 10 o'clock mass in Portlaoise. And she thought she was doing the right thing, obviously, but it was the last place on earth that myself and my brothers wanted to be, because at that stage the word had broken about what was after happening. People in the church were whispering to one another and pointing at us and looking over at us, and it just wasn't the right place to be at that time. But that's my memories of that particular night and that day then.
Obviously, you found out later, but can you talk us through the actual attack on him?
Well, what happened? The bones of what happened was that he we now know that he was followed on at least two occasions going up to Dublin to the National Stadium before that. So a month before, about a month beforehand, Oliver won the Leinster boxing title, and they were going back for something to eat after the boxing, and it was my dad and two coaches and Ollie in the car, and as they were getting out of the car, a motorbike was following them, and the guy was looking at them, and because he was looking at them, he clipped the car and came off the bike, and then a car came around the corner. The guy got up and jumped into the car, and the car drove off. Now, one of the coaches saw it and said to my dad, you know, did you see that, Brian? And he just goes, strange things happen in Dublin, you know. And that was a kind of a mentality at the time. If you wanted to see something a bit weird, you went to Dublin. You have to remember, this is 1983, like, and and that he just put it down to that. And about a month before that, he'd be going doing a referee's course or something in Dublin. There was another coach with him. And the other coach noticed a guy following him on the motorbike going down the Naas Road and said it to him. And he said, no, you're being paranoid, you know? And but that particular night, what we know is that the two guys on the bike, so there was um, I know now that definitely because he has actually told the guards he was there. The OC of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA was actually in the stadium. Okay, and there was two IRA operatives from Belfast with him um, in the stadium, and he actually named them to the Gardaí, and one of them has verified that story that they weren't there. Outside the stadium, the deputy OC, the Dublin Brigade, was there, and he's living in the United States now, over on the West Coast, and he was the spotter. So the gunman apparently didn't know my dad to see. Okay, and then so he was the spotter outside the stadium. Then you had the guy on the bike who was the main um the main driver behind the operation, I'm told. And this was a guy that was run out of Belfast, or was exiled by the provost in 1973, I think 72, 73, because of something to do with abusing children. And he had been exiled to France, and he was quite close to the individual who was OC of the Southern Brigade at the time, and he was his adjutant. So this guy brought him back from France to carry out a reorganization of the IRA in Munster. This was in the early 80s, and to do special operations. And he became the OC's adjutant. So he was the bike rider, and he was in the vicinity of the stadium, but he was waiting. He had his helmet off, standing beside the bike. An individual was able to give quite a good eyewitness uh, report on him because she saw him. She thought it was someone that she knew as she was walking up towards him about half an hour before the shooting. And then the guy that carried out the shooting was the bike rider's friend and trusted accomplice. Okay, they were later picked up a couple of months later in the Galen Weston shootout, where the IRA had attempted to kidnap Galen Weston, and Sean O'Callaghan claims it was him that tipped off the Gardaí in relation to that kidnapping. The Gardaí were waiting on the IRA gang, and they scooped up seven or eight of them after a big shootout. Um, so the guy that done the shooting, he's living in the northeast of Ireland now, quite openly. So when my dad came out of the stadium, the rest of them went back to the car, and my dad, because he had become quite friendly with the guy that won the senior heavyweight title that night, a fella called Noel Gyrey from Mullinahone and Tipperary, and my dad had been promoting his cause to get an Irish cap because my dad was on the Central Council at the time with the IABA, and he went back into the dressing room. The heavyweight final was obviously the last one. Congratulated Noel, and then came out of the stadium, and the rest of them had gone back to the car. And as he was crossing the road, um, the spotter gave the nod to the guy, the shooter, and the shooter walked up behind my dad. It was at the top of Washington Street, which is just a kind of a side street off the South Circular Road opposite the stadium. And he walked up behind him and put a gun to the base of his head, basically where his neck meets his head, and shot him. Shot him once, and turned and walked away. And then the motorbike came. He got up in the back of the bike, and the bike drove off. Um, Subsequently, they abandoned the bike uh, down by the near Portobello, down in the canal. And what we were told afterwards was, we obviously didn't realize it for until 2007, was that there was a helmet thrown up on the top of a factory beside where the bike was found, which has now been linked to the bike. And that the guards discovered that, and that a car came and then took was taking the two guys out of Dublin in the car, and that ran a red light over on Dartmouth Square somewhere, and it was a patrol car on routine traffic patrol, just saw these guys running the red light, put on the siren. The guys thought they were being chased for the shooting, and they drove on a bit and then abandoned the car and ran in whatever directions it dispersed. And but there was a lot of material evidence gathered from that car as well. There was also a newspaper that the spotter was reading had been picked up as well by the Gardaí on the night. So there was a lot of material evidence there. Two doctors from Belfast, when they heard the gunshots, obviously instantaneously knew what was going on. They were at the boxing. They came out and they did an emergency procedure called a tracheotomy, and they basically put a hole in my dad's throat, cut an airwave, and put a pipe down, plastic pipe down his throat to create an airwave, and that saved his life on the night. Um, and then he was taken to the Mead Hospital, which was quite close, and he was there for a couple of weeks and moved out to the National Rehabilitation Centre. Then he was in a coma for about 6 months, but they knew that several of his vertebrae had been severed by the bullet, so they knew he was going to be paralysed from the neck down. So he was taken straight to the Mead Hospital. But when my mother got there, the initial reports that she was given was that maybe he might lose the power of one arm, and I think by the following morning, they were telling her, no, he's if he wakes up from this, he's not going to be the same man again.
How long did he live until eventually passing?
He lived for 18 months, okay, and he was in the coma, and we initially were brought to see, so there kind of three, I suppose, three phases, you could call it, in that 18 months. There were three 6 month phases. The first 6 months, he was just in a coma in the ICU out in the rehab center. Then he was awake, and he was in a ward in the rehab center for another 6 months. And then the last 6 months, they sent him home because there was nothing more they could do for him. And they just wanted him out of the hospital, basically, because he was taking up a bed. There was two armed guardies at the end of the ward, which probably made a lot of other patients and their visitors uncomfortable. Um, but we went to see him probably, if I'm thinking about this, maybe because that was March. I know that he was still in the coma. It was shortly before he came out of the coma, but it was the summertime, and they kind of wanted to distract us a bit from it. Leeds were playing Loud in the senior football championship, and we went to the match with my uncle, and then he brought us out to the Dunleary afterwards, and we went in and to into the ICU, small ICU room. And a doctor spoke to us before we went in, and he kind of said to us, look, be expecting now that there's going to be a lot of machinery there, a lot of tubes, or a lot of wires, machines beeping. But what they didn't tell us, and which took myself and my two brothers really by surprise when we walked in, was his eyes were open. And we didn't realize that you could be in a coma and have your eyes open. And we walked in, and the first thing we thought, God, he's awake. And the nurses triggers, they saw that straight away and they said, "Oh no, 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 he's actually in a coma, but his eyes are open." And um, so she said to me, "You've the match program there, hold it over his head and point out the names and go through the team with him." And I was going down to the team and came to John Costello. John was big, famous Leash footballer time, big, strapping 6'6" guy, and John had been in the prison service. And I've spoken to John since, and he says to me, "Your dad was always trying to get me to be a boxer." Well, I said, "You had a physique for it, John. You would have. He saw you as the next Jerry Cooney." But when I got to John Costello's name, John had been in the prison service, but before my dad was shot, he had left to go and work in New York. He just wanted to find himself. And when I said John Costello, my dad's eyes lit up, and he was kind of looking at me quizzically, as much to say, "What's he playing for?" I thought he was in New York. And the nurse said, keep going, see, does he recognize anybody else?" And he didn't, but it was just a kind of a weird moment. Um, and I think he came out of the coma about a month later. And when he came out of the coma, they moved him out of the ICU to a normal bed, and we went up and down then regularly to see him. On a Sunday, we used to go up and see him.
When was it that he was able to come home eventually?
Oh, yeah, he was in the hospital for 6 months or so after he came out of the coma. And what happened then was they basically decided, look, there's nothing more we can do from here. He's holding up a bed. So my mother at that stage had to make plans to take him home. So, I mean, she's taken home this man. So he's in a rotary bed in the hospital. So he needs a rotary bed at home because you're paralyzed from the neck down. You have to keep the bed moving to prevent bed sores and stuff. So this bed cost thousands. And she had to do an extension on the house to make a bathroom for him and put a tracking system on the roof to be able to hoist him out of the bed and track him along into the toilet. She had to get a new car that would take the wheelchair. So all these things cost money, and basically the state weren't giving her any help at all. She got nothing from anybody. She had to go down to the bank and get a loan off the bank. And you have to remember at this stage they'd pensioned my dad off, and um, so he she was on a pension, a prison officer's pension, and she basically had to tell the bank, look, I need this money to do up the house, but there will be a criminal injuries tribunal coming down the line, and basically to get a solicitor's letter to say that that was the case. And they gave her the loan on the back of that. She'd pay it back when the criminal injuries came. But you know, when the criminal injuries tribunal is unique in Ireland, when you have to pay your own legal costs, and it was a senior and junior counsel, and so by the time my mother paid the legal fee, her own legal fees, and paid back the money for the loan, there was very little left of what she got out of it. But my dad came home, and it was a very, uh, it was just a very tough time when he came home, because he just was not. I suppose it was like having a child, a 2-year-old child, is the best way. But he he had he was very moody. He would forget things. He'd keep asking you the same question over and over again. His short-term memory just wasn't there. Now he could talk, but it was like literally talking to a 2-year-old. But he would remember stuff from his childhood. And then you had a lot of people who would come to see him. So you had people from the GA world, you had people from the boxing world, your ex-colleagues coming to see him. And a lot of them, initially the first visit or two, they might see him when he was a bit cranky or a bit moody, and then they got to realize this is what just the way he was, and he, simple things like I tell a story in the book like about how I was shaving him one day and he started to cry because you know he realized that he should have been at this stage, maybe showing me how to shave, and here I was at 14 or 15 shaving him, and everything was at the weekends were a big ordeal. You had to, you know, get him along that tracking system, get him showered, put him in the wheelchair, and then try and get out for the day with him somewhere. We would just go for a drive on a Saturday or a Sunday, and things like that. It was just, but like you never knew what sort of form he was going to be in. You never knew, and you were dealing with somebody who still there was a threat. The guards used to come around our house while they didn't have anyone stationed at the house. Always 3 or 4 times a day at kind of irregular times, the guards would do patrols and come in around the back of the house and stuff like that. Um, so we were cognizant of that. And then just before he died, they were at to redoing O'Moore Park, which is the main county GA ground in County Laois, and they were after rebuilding it, and it was being opened up for the county finals. And Portlaoise were actually now at 4 finals: the senior hurling, minor hurling, senior football, and minor football. And that the GA came to us because my dad had been an intercounty referee, and they knew. They said to us, "Look, would Brian like to come to the match, and you can drive the car in, and you can put the car in this slot just beside the sideline, and he can watch the game from the car." And this was a great gesture from the GAA, and the county hurling final, and when we got in, like it was brilliant that the minors who would have been kind of, I would have been still under four or under 16 at that stage, but it was the guys that were just a year ahead of me won the minor final, and they came over to my dad with the cup, and it was lovely gesture. And then the senior final was a replay, or was a draw, and but he didn't get to see the replay because that was a Sunday. We went back to school. We were in a boarding school that you went Monday to Friday and you came home to weekends. And when we were back in school on the Monday evening, I got a call on with the Tuesday evening, I got a call from the priest that was the principal, came to me and said, look, your dad, um, he he collapsed this morning and he's gone back to hospital, and your aunt is going to come and pick yourself and your brothers up in the morning. And so he didn't get to see the replay of the hurling. And when he died, but 10 days later, and when the replay was on, his funeral was the following day on the Monday. And my Uncle George had come over from England, and he would have been the closest of my father's brothers. He was the same year older than my dad. And he wanted to go to the hurling just to distract himself. So myself, my brothers went with him. And he was kind of surreal. Like, a few people came up to us and said, oh God, I remember one friend of mine saying to me, Austin, what are you doing here? And just said, look, my dad would have wanted us to come and watch the hurling. And, there was a minute's silence for him. And it was just to show the respect that people had for him in the community, because he was a real community guy. He was a boxing ref and judge, and he was secretary of the boxing club. He'd been a GA ref, and he had been, in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s and early 60s, he was the juvenile coordinator in the GA club in Portlaoise. So, he had a lot of people in the community had great time for my dad. And that mark of respect at the county final was really touching.
Obviously, you went through quite a personal ordeal with this 18 months. Then, of course, the death, which I can imagine was unbelievably tough. I don't want to keep you too much longer. The book, like I mentioned, the book is in many ways like your own journey of filling in like what happened and the truth, and you kind of coming up with the answers like years and even decades later. We'll go through them one by one. Can you can you take us through these various like meetings you had where you did confirm and find out information? I'm referring to the Garda files that came from the Barry Cummins book, the Brian Lenihan meeting, meeting Gerry Adams, and eventually going in the old mystery van to meet like an ex-senior IRA figure. Could you take us through these meetings if you could?
Well, basically, my mom was 39 when my dad died, and so she was quite young, and she had three teenage sons to bring up, and she wasn't really in a position to go ask the Gardaí, for updates and information. And so, and I know she beats herself up a little bit about that since. But when I looked to join the prison, I was got a letter in December 1990 that I was to go for my medical for the prison service. And my mother at that stage wrote a letter to the Gardaí asking them for an update on the case, and she got no answer. And she wrote again in January 91, and she got a one-line answer basically saying the case was still open, and if there was any updates, that they would let her know. Um, so after that, the first time that I got any sort of an inkling of what was going on is, I mean, the media were just reporting that the IRA, INLA, and Prisoners Revenge Group had all issued denials. And the media were kind of running with the story. And I think, to be honest with you, it was a story that was fed to them by the Gardaí, that this was independent or disaffected Republicans with a grudge. And that was the kind of media line at the time. Um, so around, it was sometime towards the early, it was in the early part of 1996. I was working in Mountjoy, and an officer who I would have known from my youth, who would have worked in Portlaoise at the time, came to me. He was working in Mountjoy at this stage. And he just said to me, Austin, do you know um, what was going on in Portlaoise at the time? Do you know what happened to your dad? And I said to him, no, I have no clue. And he told me, look, he said, there was an individual who was higher up the food chain than your dad, and he named him as a deputy governor who was, involved in the key business, copying the keys. And he said, he also told me that your dad knew the gun was in the prison. He had gone to the governor about it. And this individual told me he had been kept back a few times to search for this gun. And he also told me how the weapon had got into the prison, that this is what, prison officers were speculating as to how this gun had got into the prison. And shortly after that, within kind of a couple of months, another prison officer who I also knew, who had been very close to my dad, um, told my brother Oliver pretty much the same story. And but we nothing. It was two people telling us hearsay basically, and so we had no real hard evidence of this. But it did kind of open our eyes. This is not right. There's something not fitting here. And Barry Cummins came to me in 2007, and he reached out to me and asked me, could he write a piece, a chapter in a book he was writing about unsolved murders in relation to my dad. And he kind of sold it to me along the lines that, look, I might be able to see the file, I might be able to get you some information. And we agreed as a family that we would allow Barry to do that. And Barry came back to us, and he was allowed see the file. He was allowed 15 minutes with the file by a friendly Garda, and he was able to take notes from that file. And what he found for us, it was absolutely mind blowing to us, that there was a really good eyewitness for the driver of the motorbike. There was a lot of material evidence, fingerprints, helmet, all that sort of stuff. And he gave us all this, so we kind of put pressure on the Gardaí to meet with us. And the Gardaí from Kevin Street came down to meet with us, and they were initially trying to kind of find out what do we know, and it was kind of doing a dance with them basically. And then I said to them, look, um, you have fingerprints, and they kind of, right, okay, who told you that? And I said, look, I told them straight up, we got it from Barry Cummins. And he said, okay, yes, there is fingerprints. And then we said to him, oh, and are you going to tell us about the helmet? And I could see him roll in his eyes, and he kind of going, oh no, that they know a little bit more than we think they know. And so essentially they agreed that they had all this stuff. And so then they said to us that the cold case team were at being set up, and this might be a route as one of the first cases that the Serious Crime Review team, as they were known as officially, could have a look at. So we wrote to the Garda Commissioner and looking for a meeting, and the Garda Commissioner basically at that stage fobbed us off and said that the Serious Crime Review team would be looking at the case. So they were working away on the case, and essentially at this stage I didn't know as much as obviously I know now, and we're getting a little bits of information from them every time we meet them. They did tell us that, well, one early meeting, that the deputy governor at the time um, was a person that was mentioned to them by everybody that they spoke to in relation to the case. And at that stage, I decided that I was going to use some Fianna Fáil contacts that I had to try and get a meeting with Brian Lennon, who had just been appointed as a Minister for Justice. And Anya Brady, I was quite friendly with. She was junior minister in health at the time. So Anya said to me, Brian's coming to meet me. He's going to meet with you. He's agreed to meet you. And she said, will you come into the Dáil? And she gave me a date. I went into the Dáil to meet her, and I went down to her office, and she sat me down with a cup of tea. She said, Brian will be along in a minute. And no sign of Brian. Never turned up. and she was extremely embarrassed by it. And subsequently, I could see when I looked for a freedom of information thing, I could see the files, and Anya didn't tell me this, but I could see it, the back and forth, fax messages and emails between her office and Brian Lenihan's office, and she was basically telling your minister, or the secretary, Brian Lenihan's secretary, your minister agreed to this meeting, and so eventually the meeting was set up, and it was quite obvious that the civil servants were trying to prevent Brian Lenihan from meeting with us. And when the meeting did take place, it was quite staggering because of the high level nature of people that came into the room with Brian Lenihan. There was myself and my two brothers, my mother and Anya Brady, and we were put sitting across from a large conference table. And Brian Lenihan walked in. This is Brian Lenihan Jr. now, obviously, and the Secretary General of the Department of Justice was with him, um, who I knew from he had been a Director General of the Prison Service previously, but there must have been about 10 other senior civil servants there as well. And it was such a high-powered delegation. And Sean Aylward, the Secretary General of Justice, was basically controlling the meeting. And Brian Lenihan, it was quite obvious he was not briefed, and they obviously didn't brief him. And at one stage, he looked up, he was staring down at the table most of the time, and he looked up at me and he says, "What rank was your dad?" So that's how little he actually knew. Okay. And your man, Sean Aylward, the Secretary General of Justice, I had said to at one stage, that there was, it's our belief now that, that there was some um, prison officers involved in what happened to my dad. And he got very animated, and he said he kind of he kind of raised his voice a bit, and he said there was no senior prison officer involved in that. And I looked at him and said to him, I didn't use the word senior. You've brought that to the table, but you've now confirmed everything that I know. And with that, he kind of realized he'd made a serious boo-boo. But we went out of that meeting, and I remember going out the door, and I looked at Anya, and Anya was terribly embarrassed, Anya Brady. I said, "Anya, what the fuck was that all about?" And she said, "Oh, come on, we'll go down to the bar." And we went down to the bar, and we were sitting there. And at this stage, my brother Kieran, and Kieran doesn't get animated very often. Kieran's a kind of a businessman, and he likes to keep things very cool and calm. And he looked at Anya, and he says, "Anya, does he not know that we are a family of Fianna Fáil people? We've been Fianna Fáil all our lives. And does he not know, did nobody tell him that the lengths that Austin went to for his father, for Brian Lennon Sr.?" And there was a famous story, and I tell it in the book, about the night of the when Brian Lennon, his presidential election campaign imploded in 1990, and he after the scandal, when he was reported to have rang the president, looking for President Hillary to not call an election but to ask Charlie Haughey to see if he could form a government when the Fine Gael Labour government fell. And it became a scandal during the presidential election that, Lennon had been allegedly involved in trying to interfere in the president's duties. And he went on television and said, on mature recollection, and that he'd been on serious medication after an operation, and the campaign just imploded. And I remember that night, I was the deputy director of elections in Laois, and went down to meet a couple of people, and it was a rainstorm. It was horrendous weather. And the lads all looked at me and said, "There's no point in going canvassing tonight, Austin, after everything that happened on the TV tonight." I said, "No, tonight's the night we're going to do it." And we went up to the roughest estate in Portlaoise, and we started knocking on doors, drowned in wet we were. And the people were looking at us and going, "Well, if you're out canvassing for him tonight, he definitely means something to you, and we're going to give him a vote." And the reason I did that was because Brian Lenihan Sr. knew my dad, because he had been in and out of prison. At that stage, in those days, the Minister for Justice dealt directly with the governors and the chiefs of the prison. So he knew my dad. And when I was young and involved in youth politics, Brian Lennon Senior used to put me in the state car and drive me back. I was just a student in your work. He said, come on, I'll give you a lift, young stack. That was the way Brian Lennon Senior was. And so I had a bit of loyalty to the man, but his son obviously hadn't a clue and hadn't been told any of this. So Anya, after Kieran said it, went up and brought him back down. And he came down, he sat with us, and he said, "Look, I had no idea. I had no idea about any of this stuff." And he agreed to do what he could for us, but he was gone out of justice within the month. He only, I think, was in justice for about 2 months. But subsequent to that, the cold case team they spent a couple of years and they came up with 198 recommendations of things that should have been done at the time that weren't done. So we're talking about mapping the crime scene. We're talking about they gave us a small flavor. They told us one or two things that were in it, interviewing prisoners that were in Portlaoise at the time, interviewing some of the staff. But they weren't very specific. They just said there's 198 things that should have been done. These are one or two of them. And they brought the thing back to the Garda Commissioner, and we met with Faulkner Murphy at the time as the Commissioner, and Martin Callan was Deputy Commissioner at the time. And they basically told us that we're giving it back to the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the NBCI, who deal with gangland and terrorism. And they were going to carry out fresh investigation based on the 198 recommendations. We asked, could we see those recommendations? We were told no, it was an internal Garda file. I did say to Faulkner Murphy at the time, was there informants involved in what happened to my dad? And the reaction I got, I was just literally, I was literally, I was just fishing. And the reaction I got, particularly from Martin Callan, was the deputy at the time. He got quite angry with me. I said, "There's, there was no informants." I mean, he was the way he said it. I said to myself, "There's something on here. I'm onto something." And I went around it in a kind of another way. And he goes, "You don't give up," he said to me. He was quite, just animated about it. But Faulkner Murphy told my mother afterwards when we were leaving the meeting. He came over to her and he kind of, in a real kind of a nicely hushed voice, whispered to her. And we said to my mother afterwards, "What was he saying to you?" And he said to her, "Look, Mrs. Stack, don't be holding your hopes up for what happened here." And that investigation tumbled along for a couple of years, about 2 years. But the first thing they did, the NBCI, believe it or not, was they decided they were going to interview my mother and myself and my brothers and to take statements off of us. Okay. And believe it or not, that the first one they decided to do was to go to my mother. And my brother Oliver decided he'd sit in with her because she wasn't kind of just as moral support. But Oliver rang me when the guards were gone. He said, "My God, Austin," he said, they were treating her like a suspect. They were literally, it was like a criminal being interviewed. So the guards came to my house the following evening to interview me. And I was quite straight with them. I said, "Look, lads, it's like this. We're not the criminals here. And if you proceed to question me like you did my mother last night, I'm closing up shop. I'll throw you out." And so they agreed. Look, apologised, all the rest of it. They interviewed me over 2 evenings and I gave them, I think it's a 24, 25-page statement on the stuff that I knew at that stage. They were investigating for about 2 years, and they came, there was an inspector who was the liaison with us, and he came to me in 2011, and he said to me in January 2011, and he said to me it was his belief, and that this was the official Garda view, that the IRA hadn't carried out the attack on my dad. He said to me, "I've sat across from senior members of that organisation and they didn't do it, Austin." And at this stage, I was beginning to get bits of information. And I kind of said to him, "Man, they were the only ones with the motive. They're the only ones with the capability of doing this, keeping it secret, and getting away with it for so long." I just literally I got very angry with him, and I sent him on his way. And I decided I had to do something myself to get the answers that I knew, and I just needed it confirmed. So I hatched a plan to trap Gerry Adams to meet me, because I called on him several times in the media to meet me, and I was getting no answers. So I knew that on the 30th anniversary of the shooting, okay, that there would be a bit of media presence around the thing. So I had seen how Brian Stanley was a new Sinn Féin TD at the time, unconnected to the IRA, unconnected to the past, if you like. And Sinn Féin were very keen at the start of the political project, when they were getting inroads in Ireland, to promote people like Stanley, who had no connections to the past. And I said, if I can rattle their cage on Stanley, they might meet with me. And Stanley had basically, in 2011, during the Martin McGuinness's presidential campaign, when he came to Portlaoise, McGuinness, the first thing he was asked was, what about the Brian Stack murder? And Stanley jumped in and said, oh, the IRA had nothing to do with that. And it was printed on the front page of the local newspaper. And so I rang the local radio station and I said, look, I've done a press release for the 30th anniversary. Will you have me on Monday morning to talk about it? And say, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I said to them, well, look, get the front of the Laois Nationals from such a date. I'll be referring to the front page of that paper in the interview. So they did. And I basically went on the radio and I just said, look, Brian Stanley made this statement. And if he could be so sure that the IRA didn't murder my dad, how does he know this? What information does he have? And as a public representative, he has a duty to go to An Garda Síochána with whatever information he has. Now, I knew that was going to elicit a response from Stanley, because these guys don't take that sort of stuff lying down. Within the hour, he was on the radio show denying that he had said this, and the interviewer said, look, I'm looking at it in black and white in the paper, he did say it. And then he tried to go, well, it was my belief. And no, this is what you said, it's written in black and white. And he said, all this man wants is a meeting with your leader. And at that stage, Stanley said, well, if he emails Gerry Adams, I've spoken to Adams, Adams will basically respond to him. So I emailed Gerry Adams at his Oireachtas email address. And after a couple of emails back and forth, he agreed to meet with myself and my brother Oliver. And so that was in kind of around at the end of May, early June, off the top of my head, in 2013, that we went into the Dáil. Adams had tried to keep the meeting secret. He wanted in a secret hotel, and I said, no, whatever meeting we have first, we'll do it quite publicly. This has to be done in the public eye. And we did an interview with RT 61 News before we went in. They asked me, what did I want from the meeting with Adams? And I said to them, look, there's people within his parliamentary party who may have information, and we want the IRA to admit that they murdered my dad, and he needs to be able to put pressure on some of the individuals that are sitting on his parliamentary party. I was asked who was talking about on the 6-1 News, and I said, well, look, those likes of Desi Ellis and Martin Ferris, those were people that were in Portlaoise around that time, so they may have some information. And again, when you throw the light on their TDs, they don't like it. And we went into the meeting with Adams, and the first thing he did was he tried to intimidate myself and my brother. It was so unreal. He, in a very nonchalant way, he threw his arm at the back of the chair, and he looked at us and he said, "Oh my God, you are very brave men to come in here to me." And I'm kind of going, "Oh, you wanker," I was thinking to myself, you know. I just looked at him and I said, I kept calm, and I just looked at him and I said, look, there's nothing brave about coming in to see a TD in Dáil, and I've been in here 1,001 times. It doesn't faze me at all. And he tried to change track then, and he says, well, we're all victims here. He says, my brother-in-law or someone belonged to him was shot. I had watched him on he had been interviewed on prime time about a month beforehand, and it was a very famous prime time interview that he did, where Mary McCallaghan went through him for a shortcut about my dad and Tom Oliver. And during that, he had kept trying to play the victim card, that he was a victim, and that he knew nothing about my dad's murder. And my young son Freddie was 9 at the time, and when I kept replaying that, I recorded it and kept replaying it to see the way Adams was going to answer the questions. I was my research before I went to meet him, and Freddie said to me, "Oh my God, that man keeps saying that he had nothing to do with Grandad Brian's murder. Why don't you believe him?" And I kind of got to going, "Oh my God, this is what they're at." You know, you tell the lie often enough, people will believe it. And but so I had said to my brother Oliver, he's going to play the victim card. This is what he does. He claims he was a victim. And so when he does that, leave it to me. Oliver says, I'm saying nothing. He says, I'm just ears or eyes and ears, you know, and a second pair of eyes and ears. And when he said to me that he was also a victim, I did the whole fake anger thing. I shouted at him and I jabbed the finger like that. I said to him, "You're bang the table. You're not the victim here. I'm the victim. My brother Oliver here is the victim. My mother, who's sitting across in a hotel across the way because she's too afraid to come over, she's a victim." I said, "I tell you what a victim is. Victim is someone that gets up at 2 o'clock in the morning when their dad is shouting for someone to come and scratch their nose." I said, "That's what a victim is." I said, "You know nothing about that." And he kind of bolted up in the seat and he was staring at me, and it was a bit of a kind of a couple of seconds, and then I just flipped it and I went back into calm mode and I just said to him, "Now, deputy, I'm here because I want your help and I'm asking you to help us." And he kind of looked at me and he was so, "Well, what can I do for you?" I said to him, "Look, I'm asking you to go and talk to people within your movement, your organization, to see if we can get some answers for us." I said, "We want an admission that the IRA did this." I said, "I know the IRA did it." And he looked at me and he go, "How do you know that?" I asked him. Well, I said, "I know that there was a member of the Army Council sanctioned it. I know that the individual who organised it went to that individual on 3 or 4 occasions looking for sanction. And on the fourth, I think it was the fourth occasion, he was given sanction to do it." And Adam said to me, "Oh, that's not how the IRA worked, Austin." And I said to him, "Well, that's my information." And he said to me, "Do you want to give me any names?" And I said, "No, I'm not here to give you names." And but I said, "I would appreciate if you would talk to people within your parliamentary party that were in Portlaoise in around that time that may be able to get some information." And with that, he Richard Macaulay was with him, his assistant, and they got up and they said, "Look, we have to go out and have a chat about this. We'll send in tea and sandwiches to you." They went out, and of course there was an iPhone left on the table face down, and my brother Oliver pointed at the iPhone and just pointed through his mouth and said, "They're recording us, you know." And it actually is so funny because later on, um, when there was a bit of a barney about that particular meeting and what was said and what wasn't said, I put in the public mail, I think they recorded us. So if there's any ambiguity about this, let them produce the recording, And they produced an email that Richard Macaulay said he wrote a number about a week later or something. But he basically packed up what we said because their notes actually said Adams asked me for names, and I said, "No, I'm not here to give you names." But it counted everything that Adams. It was during the 2016 president or your general election when I was asked by the media, did I think Sinn Féin were fit for office, and I said no. And I was asked why, and I said because I said they weren't truthful with us. They went so far, but I said they weren't fully truthful with us. And I said also, I said I'm aware that one of the individuals who was involved in my dad's attack was involved in abusing children, and he's being protected by the Sinn Féin movement in the United States at the moment. And Adam said at that stage, tried to put it into the media the last week of the campaign that I'd given him names. And he started off saying I'd given him, I think, 2 names. And by the end of the week, it was 3 or 4 names. Um, and then subsequently, and about 9 months later, it transpired that he had written an email to the guards, to the Garda commissioner, basically saying that I gave him these names. It was a cover operation he was trying to pull off. And I leaked that into the media, which of course didn't go down well, but it then blew up into Adams having to make a statement to the Dáil, a personal statement in which he told several lies, and I've no problem saying the lies. I wrote that in the book. I said it at the press conference that I did afterwards, and he never counted that. But I mean, we were told when we essentially the meeting we had with Adams led to a meeting where we went off in a van up the into it transpires we were in South Armagh. Um, Initially, myself and Adams and my brother Oliver met 3 or 4 times to arrange. And Adams had said to us, we said we wanted to meet the individuals who had murdered my dad because I'm a restorative justice practitioner. I believe very strongly in restorative justice. I also believe that a lot of the foot soldiers that were involved in the IRA were pawns that were used by those higher up. And I believe that if I had to be able to talk to the individuals to pull the trigger, maybe some of them would resonate with what I was saying, with the effects of it and stuff like that. Adams told us that wasn't going to be possible. He said to us that we wouldn't be doing that, that wouldn't be happening. We had conversations about legacy and about the a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and stuff like that, like they had in South Africa. I proposed to him things like I said, look, if what I would be happy with would be if there was an amnesty at the end of the process if the families wanted it. So I said what I would do is I would say, look, if our family agreed to go into a Truth and Reconciliation conference and with an independent international mediator, we were told the whole truth, then that was said in the confines of that commission could not be used to prosecute somebody. Okay. Uh, and I said, then at the end of the process, if the family felt that they were dealt with truthfully, they could say to the thing, well, we recommend that there's an amnesty for that individual. And, Adam said, no, the amnesty has to be given at the start of the process. And I said, no, that won't work for the victims because I said, if you give somebody an amnesty at the start of a process, you can never be guaranteed you're going to get the truth. It just doesn't work that way. There has to be a carrot and stick approach to this. But we had all those discussions with him, and he then came to us and said to us that he had asked a friend of his to carry out an investigation, an internal IRA investigation to what my dad, and he was prepared to meet with us. And we agreed to meet, and it was kind of shredded in secrecy. We were told basically it was a bank holiday weekend coming up and to have ourselves available for the whole weekend. And we would get a call the night before.
Sorry to interrupt. What year is this?
So this is 2013. So this is July 2013. So we're told the August bank holiday, or the bank holiday weekend, yeah, that we're told leave your whole weekend free. And basically then we were called and we were told to meet at the Regency Hotel where the famous uh, Kin and Hutch shootout took place. And we went in there, told to be there for 11 o'clock. And we knew the meeting was going to be moved. We that just that sense. And Richard Macaulay, Adams's assistant, came in at about 20 past 11 and said, "Okay, lads, my car is outside. It's a green Citroen. Uh, Follow me." So he said, "Take one car, no phones," and we followed him up to the City North Hotel outside Drogheda and down to a car park. And Adams is standing beside his own car. We pulled him beside it. Macaulay got out of his car, got into the driver's seat of Adams's car. Adams got in the passenger seat. We're then put in the back and we're going up the motorway up towards Dundalk. And Adams turned around and said to us, "Look, lads, you're going to get an admission here today." And we were kind of looking at each other and going, "Oh, great." And then we entered into all this small talk and we were kind of ahead of ourselves. And it was really sunny Saturday morning and we pulled off the motorway into some small village in County Louth. And there was a pub just after opening and it just was picturesque now. And the sun was absolutely beating down the streets. And Adams went in and came back out with toffee and scones and whatnot. And um, Richard Macaulay said to me, "So I love my coffee, And I said, "Oh, right, yeah." I meant to make coffee myself, and I said I might get one of them espresso machines, and they were all the rage at the time. And he said to me, "Oh, what kind of coffees do you like for the espresso? And here I am with these guys and we're going to be getting into a blacked out van in a couple of minutes, and we're discussing bloody espresso coffee with them, you know? It's just, it was surreal. And we went off, we got back in the car and we came off the motorway at the last, there's three exits for Dundalk, the very last one. And the last was he come to the Ballymiscanlon roundabout. And I decided I'm going to throw Adams off the scent here. I'm really going to wind him up. And I said to him, oh God, we're at the Ballymiscanlon. And I said, God, a great part of the country, this. And he said, oh, do you know it? Oh God, I said, yeah, I know it very well. I said, this is where my grandfather, my father's dad was from up here. I said, the Ballymiscanlon Hotel. I said, we spent a lot of our youth there. I said, my father's first cousin owns that hotel. Oh, right. So my grandfather won an All-Ireland football medal with Loud. He really was kind of completely thrown. And we turned left after that roundabout and we went kind of up the road a bit. We came to this disused cemetery, and I found out since it's a Foggart Cemetery, it's called, and it's quite a famous cemetery. The last High King of Ireland is buried there. And from a historical perspective, it's quite a famous place. But there's a small car park in the front of it, and there was a Ford Transit van there, and with Northern plates on it, and a small, low-sized, heavyish guy was standing beside it. And we put up the car, and we got out of the car. Now, Adams had said to us, you know, that there was going to be part of this journey in a blacked out van, so we knew that was happening. But we got into the van, and Adams and Macaulay came in the back of this van with us, but it was plyboard screwed into the far wall of it for seats. And then all the windows that had been plyboard cut to measure and screwed into the windows. And then there was a big sheet cut to measure between the cab and the back of it. So you could not see out. And we were driven in that van for about 10 minutes. And then you could hear the road changing, and we were going down gravel, so we knew we were coming into a house. And the next thing, the van stopped, and next thing, the door of the van opened, and we literally walked from the van into a kitchen. The driver had brought the van to within millimeters of the sliding patio door of a kitchen. Okay, so the guy in the kitchen opened the door, pulled back the patio sliding door, and then opened the van door. And we literally stepped from the van into the kitchen. It was unreal. And the curtains were pulled down the kitchen, and then we were introduced to this guy. Said, "Oh, this is the owner of the house," and Adams thanked him for his hospitality and all the rest of it. So he sat in the kitchen with Richard Macaulay, and myself and Adams and Oliver were guided through a French doors into a front room. And there was a guy sitting there, and he looked for all the world like a middle-aged school teacher, and reading a copy of the Irish Times. And he got up and he introduced himself, and he said, "My name is John. But that's not my real name. It's my name for this meeting." And he said, "I had a senior role in the IRA all during the struggle." And he said, "At the time of the ceasefire, he said, I had a very senior leadership role." And he said, "I have a prepared statement for you." And Adams had asked us to give him a list of questions before the meeting. Okay. So we had done that only on the proviso that we could ask some follow-on questions. But the statement that they had designed was basically designed to answer a lot of questions. So in that statement, and I give the full statement in the book. But it basically it gave an admission of what they did, but they said that it was IRA volunteers that carried out the attack on my dad, and it was a person that had a leadership role within the IRA had was the one that organised it. Um, they then went on to say that it hadn't been sanctioned by the Army Council, which was a lie, and I challenged them on that. And Adams at that stage said to us, "Well, we didn't know that it was our volunteers that done this for 3 years. And when we found out, we sanctioned the individual or we disciplined the individual that had sanctioned it." Now, obviously, we didn't want to know what that sanction was, but I don't believe that actually happened. I said to Adams, "So that's not really feasible that you didn't think this was your guys done this." And he says to me, "Oh, it could have been, anybody." He says, "It could have been ordinary criminals. It could have been the INLA." And I said to him, "Look, ordinary criminals wouldn't be able to keep this a secret for a long time because they just rat each other up. when they go into the next time they're lifted, in order to, to get a lighter sentence or for them not to be charged, they rat somebody else up. So I said, it wasn't ordinary criminals. And I said, the bottom line is, I said, the INLA didn't have the capability to pull this off. And he looked at me and he goes, well, they pulled off Airy Neve, didn't they? And I said, yeah, but it was about the only real kind of thing that took planning that they pulled off in the whole Troubles. I said they were really a ragtag organization. And I said, you guys, on the other hand, robbed the bike a month beforehand and kept it hidden. You guys were able to have a team there and then another team to spirit that team out at Dublin. You kept it quiet all these years. I said, you had the motivation, you were trying to plan an escape. I said, you look, don't try and tell me you didn't know. I said, that just does not wash on me. And we went into a whole lot of other discussions with them. They tried to they said the context of the shooting my dad was, they tried to put that frame it as being prison conditions. That as he described it, the struggles within prisons in Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the South. And I said, what prison struggles? And he said, well, our people, when this wasn't Adams, this was John, said that, well, our people were being strip searched, our prisoners were being strip searched. And he said our visitors had to endure seeing their visitors through screens and stuff. And I said to him, well, I said, you do realize, I said, that that's not unique to IRA prisoners. I said, in 2013, there was two prisons in the Irish prison estate at that time that only had screen visits. And one was Cloverhill, the Remand Centre, and the other was St. Patrick's, the Juvenile Centre. And I said, those two prisons only have screen visits. So I said, and I said, and every day, in every prison in the country, on every landing, there's two prisoners, what you would describe as strip searched every day on every landing. So I said, this is not unique to IRA prisoners. And he looked at Adams, and Adams says, oh, Austin knows these things because he's a prison officer. Your man didn't know what I did, but I said, so your context is really nonsense. It was that sort of a discussion we had. But the crucial thing for us that came out of that meeting was they actually admitted that they'd done it. They admitted it was IRA people, IRA volunteers on an IRA operation that murdered my dad, which was crucial. So when I was asked afterwards at the press conference, what did I think, I said, well, we got 70% of the truth. And I thanked Adams for having gone through that process with us. I do believe that, the reason they didn't want to fully admit it was that two of the people that were in the room in Portlaoise, in the house in Portlaoise 2 weeks beforehand when the operation was being planned, at that stage in 2013 were very senior Sinn Féin politicians. So Sinn Féin had to, keep themselves one step away from this, and they knew that I could implode on their political campaign if their political prospects, the political project, so to speak, if they had to admit fully what went on here, because, as I said, there was two extremely senior Sinn Féin politicians in the room, in the house in just outside Portlaoise when the operation was being planned. So that's how the context of how we got to that space with them, and how we got that, and I remember Barry Cummins coming to me afterwards and saying, my God, Aston, he said, that was some piece of work you did getting the IRA to actually, the IRA don't do this. He said, you've gotten the IRA to actually admit that they murdered your dad. He said, that took some going. And, he was right. But I suppose I just kept doing it. I kept after it, and I kept putting them in, boxing them into corners until they did. And then within a week, the guards were back onto me, and we had no contact with the guards for like 2 or 3 years at this point, since January 2011. And this is now, we're in August 2013 now. We had no contact with the guards in the meantime, because the guards had basically I threw them out, and I said I want nothing more to do with it. And I knew liaison officer had been appointed, and he tried to make contact with me, and I kind of fobbed him off. And he said, "Look, will you at least meet me and hear me out?" And I met with him, and I have to say, he's the one guard through the whole process that we've had with the guards that was in charge. He was in charge, put in charge of the investigation. That I can say, honestly, said I trusted him, and honestly say that after all our bad experiences with the guards, this was the one guy who I felt was genuinely trying to solve the case, genuinely trying to solve it. And in fairness to him, he did his best. But again, we encountered issues where I got information from a former very senior Garda who was encountered terrorism during the Troubles. And he told me basically the same information that Sean O'Callaghan had given me, and the same information that I'd got from a journalist who had spoken to two IRA people. Okay. And he gave me the same information, the same individuals. And he he said to me he had got his information from a high level informant, and that he had put all that information on a file, and that crime and that sorry that NBCI, the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he had phoned them and told them where that information was. I put that to the Gardaí, and the guy that was in charge of the investigation at this stage, he said he had not seen this information. And they went away, and they came back to me a number of months later. And the since deceased John O'Driscoll, who was an assistant commissioner, was at that meeting, and he said to me, Austin, he said, I have to admit that your information was good. He said, we have found that information. And he said the informant had, yes, he said, but the information was basically in crime and security, who was like, for your listeners that don't understand how the Irish intelligence service works, we don't have a separate intelligence service in Ireland, like say MI5 or MI6 in the UK, or CIA or FBI in the States. Everything is done within the Gardaí, and the intelligence service within the Gardaí is crime and security, and they're in the Phoenix Park. And basically, this document was in crime and security, and they hadn't given it to the investigation team. And the document was passed to them. And the informant, so I said then to the investigation team, have you actually met this informant? And they said no. And I gave them a number of months to meet the informant, or else I was going into the media and exposing what was going on. They came back to me. They said they hadn't met him. I went into the media, and of course, the Minister for Justice then said, "Oh well," I said, "there's one section of the guards not cooperating with the other," and the minister said, "Oh, they were," and I got into a bit of he said, she said, and eventually, the what I'm led to believe happened was that the investigation team sent someone from crime and security to meet with the informant and to ask him would he cooperate with the investigation, and would he go meet the investigation team. And the information that came back was that this guy was of no value to the investigation, and the impression we were given was that he was too ill, that he was suffering maybe from Alzheimer's or something like that. And but what is it's crucial about that is that by this stage Sean O'Callaghan was dead. So I knew then it wasn't Sean O'Callaghan, wasn't the informant. Okay. So sometimes when you grade intelligence, if you get it from one person, it's not very good. If you get it from two people, it get and so forth. So we had four different people, but what I was afraid of was that O'Callaghan had told was the guard source, and then maybe O'Callaghan was the journalist source. But the guards had confirmed then that O'Callaghan was dead at this stage, and they confirmed that the informant that the guards had was a different guy who was still alive. And the journalist had two sources. So we definitely we definitely had three unlinked separate sources with the same information. Um, but we asked then that we had a meeting with Drew Harris in 2019, 2020, and we looked for an apology off him over the three separate investigations, and basically the the way those investigations were handled. way the guards messed up in each of those investigations. And we were being advised by a solicitor who didn't think that we would get such an apology. And I remember going in a meeting, we met with them, and Drew Harris said to me, we had an agenda, and he said, I see in your agenda here you want an apology. And he said, I'll have to. Now, at this stage, he was after going through the quagmire of different mess ups that the guards had done in the different investigations. And we'd probed him on the 198 recommendations and asked him, could we have cited this? And he says, no, the internal guard document. We talked to him about the fingerprints and stuff going missing, the helmet going missing, all that stuff went missing apparently. Can't find it. Why the person who was an eyewitness wasn't put in an ID parade with somebody? The informant, why was this informant the most recent informant? Why that information wasn't passed to the investigation team as far back as 2009 when they had that information? He could have been in a better mental condition at that time. And he went through all that with us and was making various excuses for why things were the way they were. And then I said, Jesus, well, what? I said to him, well, what about the apology? And he goes to me, I'll have to think about that. And I just looked at him and I started shouting at him. I says, again, I do the fake anger thing sometimes. It has an effect. I says, you mean they're going through the catalogue of errors, the catalogue of mess ups, and three separate guard investigations. And you're sitting here now and asking me, what sort, and you're telling me I'll have to think about apologizing to you. I said, you just outlined all the stuff that you did wrong. And he kind of, okay, I'll give you an apology. And with that, the solicitor looked at us. I goes, can I have a minute with my clients, please? And the guards went out of the room. I said, I can't believe it was that easy, he said. And I kind of goes, well, again, you kind of box them into a corner. Sometimes they have to do what they have to do. And I said, no, I said, we have to push him and getting it in writing and making it public. So he comes back in and he says, what sort of a statement do you want? Andrew Harris said to us, or what kind of an apology do you want? And I said, okay. I said, we want you to release a statement to the media after this meeting saying that you've apologized to us for the inadequacies of three separate investigations, not just the original one, but three separate guard investigations. And I said, we want a letter from you in writing. And he said, fair enough, done. And he did. He released a statement to the media and he sent us a letter a number of months later. Now what we have done is I asked the Taoiseach to Micheál Martin when he was previously Taoiseach to would he make a statement? Well, what I did was I got Michael Healy-Rae to ask a question under leaders' questions. Would the Taoiseach make a state apology on behalf of the state for the way that my dad's investigation was carried out, the investigation into his murder was carried out. And the Can Call at the time, Shauna for real, wouldn't allow the question. And what came back to Michael Healy-Rae at the time was more or less that it was a question that should be directed to the Minister for Justice. So we have a meeting with the current Minister, Jim O'Callaghan, next week in relation to that topic. So it's something that I'll be pushing Jim O'Callaghan on in the next week or so. And we've agreed meeting with him. But, it's something that every little fight you have, we had our fights with Sinn Féin and with the IRA. And we eventually got them to admit what they did. Even if they didn't give us a full and frank admission, they went about 70% of the way there. In relation to my dad's case, there's possibly informants involved. Definitely the investigation stopped after about a month. That's quite clear from the file. Why did that happen? Possibly the guards uncovered that the deputy governor at the time was in league with the IRA. You also have to factor in, did Sean O'Callaghan tell the guards, we don't know, that my dad was going to be a target? Or was it the guards who were playing God, or was it Sean O'Callaghan was playing God? We don't know. But when simple things, the state fights you at every leg of at every corner. They never recognised my dad anywhere in the prison service. And when I became an assistant governor in 2012, my governor in Wheatfield Prison, Colin Bartley, came to me and he says to me, he was at me up in Northern Ireland at the annual commemoration for the prison officers that were murdered up in the north. And he came back to me and he says, God, Alston, I'm terribly embarrassed. He said, you're now an assistant governor. And he said, there's not even a plaque anywhere in the prison service down here to commemorate your dad. And I said, that's right. And he says, do you mind if I bring this up with the Director General? And I said, no, work away, Colin. I'd be glad if you did. And he came back to me the following day and he says to me, you're going to get a call from the Director General and he's going to ask you to a meeting. And he said, he's going to ask you, what do you want? So I said, have a think about it. So your man rang me the following day. I went across to meet him in his office. He said to me, no, I knew straight away what I wanted. I wanted them to name the prison service college after my dad because it's on the main Dublin road in Portlaoise, beside the two prisons. So it's very visible. It's right on the main thoroughfare. When people are IRA people are going to visit, or people in Portlaoise prison had to walk past it. And then for younger people coming up who didn't know anything about my dad, weren't even born then, it's a reminder and they start to ask questions. I remember even a young student came to me. She was doing a project for a leaving cert and she contacted me on Facebook and she said, I saw your dad's name on the front of the training college named after. And said it piqued my interest as to what that was all about. And she said, can I interview you as part of my history project? You know, but eventually, so that's, I went and I met with Michael Donlan, the Director General, and he said to me, what would you like, Austin? And I said, well, you've asked me here, so you tell me what you guys are planning, and I'll bring it back to the family. He says to me, well, we're knocking down the old D-wing inside Portlaoise, and we're going to make a nice garden inside the walls of the prison there, and it'll be a lovely garden, we'll name it after your dad. And I looked at him and I said, that's very nice, Michael, really nice. But I said, there's a problem with it. And he said, what's that, Austin? I said, well, you said it yourself. It's in behind the wall. It's invisible. No one will ever see it. Can my mother go in and sit in it? No. And he then said to me that stage, well, what do you think? I said, rename the college after him. Rename the Prison Service College. And he said to me, oh, well, he done everything to dissuade me. He says, well, look in the Northern Ireland, he said, during the downturn there, he said, the prison service, the police, and the fire brigade all amalgamated their colleges. So he said that college might be there in 20 years' time. And I says, well, look, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And he then says, well, name changes don't really take off. And I said, well, they renamed the Mountjoy Female Prison the Doka Centre. And I said, it took about 3 years to take off, but it did. And he says, you've an answer for everything, haven't you? I said, yeah. So he agreed. And then he said they would also, the gold um, the gold medal for bravery in the prison service would be renamed the Stack Medal, and they would redesign it. And he said, we'll also do a bronze bust of your dad and put that down to college. So I said, lovely, brilliant. And walked away from that meeting. The following day, there was a subcommittee put together. And again, my governor, Colin Bartley, was on that subcommittee. And he came back from that meeting and he said to me, Austin, what did you agree with them yesterday? And I told him. And he said, well, that's not what they're talking about today. He said, they're talking about renaming a building within the training college after your dad. And I said, watch this. And I started typing an email to the Director General. And Colin was going, oh God, Austin, don't write an angry email, And I go, no, watch this, Colin. Michael, just want to confirm what we agreed yesterday. One, Prison Service Training College should be renamed Brian Stackhouse. Two, Prison Service Gold Medal for Bravery renamed the Stack Medal. Three, Bronze Bust. And sent it off to him. And he was obviously at his desk, and Colin is still standing beside me, and the email comes back from the Director General. Agreed. And I said, look at Colin, and I goes, there you go. And he said, that's brilliant, Austin. There's no coming back from it now. I said, yeah. But it just shows you that every step of the way you have to fight the state, because the civil servants don't want it. And we had a Barney with them over the name, what they were writing on the bloody bronze bust. We wanted Defender of the State written on that, and they said no, that was too political. And eventually we read and servant of the state. But you have to fight them on every single turn. They just, the civil servants do not want to agree to anything that they feel might leave the state exposed. And there's no kind of, I suppose, should we say, it's just a reluctance to give people the truth and to tell people the truth. And people talk about the British side and the Troubles not releasing files and not giving truth. The Irish government are as bad in some circumstances, and it kind of galls me to say it because at the time, people, for your listeners that. Yeah, I know you're going out in the United States for this, so there may be second, third generation Irish Americans listening to this. There may be people that were even young people in Ireland at the time that might have been 7, 8, 9, 10, who are now living in the States, who may not have a real good memory of what was actually going on in Ireland at the time. And the troubles had spilled down into the south. There was bank robberies, and I mean, you look at there's a lot of uh, podcasts and a lot of these YouTube videos done with these guys that are ex-IRA terrorists who to be interviewed, and they come across as your nice cuddly grandfather types, and they're telling Boy Scout stories about what they did during the war, and it all looks and sounds very nice, and they they're turning it into a I don't know, like a bloody you know a, a famous five novel, like.
like kind of a romanticized version of what is a very ugly, gritty thing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And like they'll tell you, that the volunteers down south had to rob banks to fund the operation in the north. But they'll very quickly scout around the story of the Rhine man down in Waterford that was on his that was on his holidays down in Tremor when the IRA gang went to rob the Bank of Ireland in Tremor, and he was in getting with his young son getting a few quid out of the bank for the holidays, and he was walking out of the bank as the IRA team were coming in to rob the bank. And they literally, he was in the doorway and they knocked him to the ground, shot him in the head, and kept going to in front of his 5-year-old son to go and rob the bank. Okay, and so they don't, and this completely innocent man that done nothing. And so when they romanticize and tell their nice stories about their Boy Scout stories, they won't tell you that those stories. Those are the stories that they conveniently leave out. And people, 1983 was the year my father was shot. Was a particularly horrific year in the Troubles. You had my dad being shot. You had the kidnapping of Shergar. You had the attempted kidnapping at Gale and Weston, where there was a massive shootout. And then you had the kidnapping of Don Tidy and the murder of recruit Garda Gary Sheehan and Private Paddy Kelly up in Ballinamore. And like people don't realize that these things were happening down south. They think it was maybe confined to the north, and there was all the bank robberies going on all along in relation to that as well. The IRA had taken over the control of the drug trade in Dublin at the time. There were certain drug dealers allowed to deal while others weren't, and the drug dealers that were allowed to deal had to pay a tariff to the IRA. The IRA took over um, the 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 security operation at nightclubs and stuff. And again, people had the security at the bouncers had to pay a tariff to the IRA. So there was all that stuff going on down south that people, when they tell the nice Boy Scout stories and the romanticizing of the troubles, it, we, that stuff is conveniently forgotten. And you know, it's to me that sort of stuff needs to be particularly told to an Irish American audience who sometimes um, look at the troubles through rose tinted glasses. And I'd love to I'd love to go out and talk to some Irish American groups and just, give them the other side of the story. And like, I'm not a guy that's bitter. I just tell it as I'm known for someone that tells it as it is. But I'm not bitter in any way. I went through a process myself. I, when I was young, when I was 19, 20, I was very angry. And while I didn't wasn't one for looking for revenge, but if somebody had said to me, there's a guy that been convicted, your father, and the death penalty is still in play. We're looking for a hangman. Would you pull the lever? I'd gladly done it. Gladly. Okay. But you go through a process and you go on a journey and as I said, I certainly wouldn't have been one. I was in a room one time in an academic situation where an ex-IRA man was trying to explain to an international audience how he he he, he became involved in the IRA because he saw someone being shot with a plastic bullet outside his house, and this guy became a bomber. And I then looked at the international audience he was talking to, and I said, "Well, if you want to take that level um of an excuse for someone joining a terrorist organization or someone becoming a bomber," I said I should have been the biggest mass murderer in Ireland. I mean, why I didn't take up a gun to get revenge and go and shoot people. Like I said, my father was actually murdered in a very horrific way, but I didn't take up gun to go and revenge. And this man is telling you that he joined the IRA using it as an excuse that he saw someone being shot with a plastic bullet. So those are equate one with the other, please. And the international audience kind of going, "Oh right, yeah, he has a point." But I I would have been someone that would have been, I had sleepless nights. I literally could not sleep for years, 20 odd years. And I wrote an article during the presidential election in 2011 about Martin McGuinness, and it was very bitter, and I put it away. And I went back to it a couple of days later, and I kind of calmed it down a bit. And I sent it to the Irish Independent that printed it. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine, and she said to me, "God, Austin, that's very bitter." I said, "You should have seen the first draft." And this woman was quite religious, and she said to me, "You need to learn how to forgive." And I just said to her, "Look, we stop with all that out religious shite." And I said, "Look, I've no time for that. I'm just telling it as it is." I said, "No, seriously, Aston, think about this. You'll be the better for it." I was going home that evening. I was thinking about it all day. And it was like I was struck by a bolt of lightning. I was outside a soccer ground on the way home. And next thing, the thought came into my head. If I can forgive them for me, not for them, okay? That I'm saying to them, you did this. Here's the monkey. I'm carrying this monkey on my back. Give them back the monkey. Give them their monkey back. No, you were the monkey. You did this. You take responsibility for it. I'm forgiving you. Away with you now. And it means that I'm not the one that's carrying all this stuff. I can sleep at night. I'm not getting bitter. I can live my life. I can challenge them and I can look for answers off them and I can point out where they're being facetious, where they've been wrong, where they're being, trying to be, cover up the past. And I can do it and I can sit down with people from that organization and strategically point out these things to them without being bitter. And I've encouraged other people to kind of go down that. Like if they're able, now not everybody can do that. Everybody goes on a journey, and I remember going to meet a meeting up in Cookstown up in Tyrone, and I was asked to go and talk to them, and there was a group of like there must have been nearly 100 people, but a lot of them were ex-UDR families. Okay, so I go into the meeting and I stand up and I say to them, "I'm a Southern Nationalist Republican," and you can see them all shifting very uneasily in their seats. And they're looking at the guy that invited me, and we're kind of going, "Oh, what have you brought here to us?" And you kind of explain to them then what a Republican is. I says, "No, what Gerry Adams is. If my family were brought up as Republicans, we basically don't believe in a monarchy. We don't. We believe that power comes from the people. Everybody, no matter what your creed is, no matter what the color of your skin is, no matter where you were born, what social class you're from, everybody has an equal voice." I said, "That's the republicanism I believe in." that's, I said, yes, I'm a nationalist. But I said, the one thing that binds us is, I said, my father wore a uniform and was defending the state against the IRA, the same as you people would envisage that your people were wearing a uniform and defending your community from the IRA. And I said, that is what binds us. I said, well, I said, I am being very clear with you. I am this, I am a Republican nationalist. And they kind of, some of them got it. And what I was saying then about the road to forgiveness, but forgiven not for them, but for you. And good few of them came up to me afterwards and they were saying to me, Michael Aston, yeah, I get what you're saying. And then more of them said to me, look, we could never go there. Um, and, you know, I said to them, look, it does take time, maybe if you think about things, because there's no point in you letting yourself become unwell or letting your own mental health be affected, because then you become, maybe a bigger victim of what the IRA have done. You've become a secondary victim, if you like. It's kind of hard to explain it, but if you allow your own situation to get out of control and your own mental health to get out of control, um, they have another victim.
Just as like a wrap up, because the book is called Justice for My Father. I'd recommend anyone buy it. It is an excellent book. But the word justice, I guess it must be kind of bittersweet in a way, given that zero members of the group or the actual crowd responsible for your fathers, that the ones who were there on the night, and the shooters and spotters and those who sanctioned it, none of them have ever been tried or much less convicted for the thing. So kind of as a wrap up, and one more question about Gerry Adams, but as a wrap up on that, like, of everyone involved and the shooters and the spotters and there on the night, do you kind of know who each of them are, or at least most?
So basically, yeah, I know who they all are. I know where they all are. Okay, I know who they are and where they are. I at this stage, look, I don't want to see anybody going to prison at this stage, okay? Because prison is not going to bring my dad back, okay? And there's going to be grandchildren without grandfathers, and that's not. But I would like to see somebody convicted to have a conviction registered against their name, okay? Now, if there was a restorative justice meeting or something like that put forward at some sort of a truth and reconciliation commission, I would gladly go along with something like that. And because at this stage, we're 40, 50 years on, putting somebody in prison is not going to achieve anything. So for me, justice will be maybe seeing a conviction registered against somebody, but not necessarily prison. But in relation to the book, John, if your US audience want to get a copy of the book, Kenny's.ie ship worldwide at no extra charge. So if you just maybe put that in the links for the podcast, Kenny's.ie, they ship worldwide, and I know that cousins of mine in Australia and friends of mine on the continent of Europe have got the book from them, and it has worked out quite, they deliver quite speedily at no extra cost.
Okay, so just yeah, just like to wrap up on the guys involved. Do you know where like each of them are? You mentioned one. You mentioned there's like at least one in America, one in the northeast of Ireland.
Yeah, there's so the guy that pulled the trigger is in the northeast of Ireland. The guy that or organized the whole thing and was the main and drove the bike with the main motivator. He's living in Texas. Okay, the spotter is living out in the west coast of America. Um, and he can be quite does some media stuff from time to time. And the the guy that was the OC, the Southern Brigade that sanctioned it, is living up in the northwest of Ireland, still alive. And the OC, the Dublin Brigade, who was in the National Stadium on the night, he is on continental Europe. And he's also wanted in the Jerry McCabe situation and murder as well. So he's on continental Europe. So there's these guys are all still around. Like there's none of them have passed away yet.
You mentioned in the book there towards the end, you said that after the Provo Scooby-Doo van meeting, your relationship with Adams wasn't like you know good or anything, but it was to get worse. You said.
Yeah, it got worse after, as I said to you earlier, when I was asked in 2016. I had no real contact with him. The one contact I had with Adams after the meeting, after we met, went up into, so we were brought into South Armagh, and Adams told us we would always remain on the southern side of the border. But the statement he made to the Dáil, he said we were in South Armagh. But he rang me about a month or maybe 2 months afterwards, and he said to me, "Look, sorry for not being in contact with you, but," he said, "I was dealing with that little family matter," and that was the trial was going on of his brother Liam for raping his niece, and he described it as the little family matter, which I kind of went, "That's a bit much, describing it like that." But he then in 2016, obviously, when the election, relationship, I hadn't heard from Adams in the meantime, but I'd always thought we kind of left on okay terms. He did want me to put a line in our statement saying I didn't want any charges brought against anyone, but I had said to him that we would only do that if we got the full 100% truth of them. And he badgered me a bit on that in the week between the meeting and when we released the statements. And as I say, he phoned me then about 2 months later, and then I heard nothing from him ever after that. And then in 2016, the election campaign, he didn't like me saying that I didn't think they were fit for office. And at that stage, then he contrived this whole thing of me giving him names. And then when I found out 9 months later he had sent it to the Gardaí, I leaked that, and I basically called into question his truthfulness, and it got into a bit of a he said, she said, and he then was forced into giving us a personal statement to the Dáil, which a TD can stand up for 15 minutes. But the thing about a personal statement is they can't be questioned on their statement. They just have 15 minutes to make a statement. And he told a number of lies in that. And I but at the end of it, a journalist had got another TD to um, ask a question in the Dáil, and basically the TD stood up and said that Desi Ellis and Martin Ferris had been two of the names that I gave to Adams. And he read that into the record at the Dáil, and there was a huge row in the Dáil, and I actually thought that Ferris and Ellis were going to come down and tackle their man, but that became a media story then rather than what I went outside and I was trying to get the media to look at the fact that Adams had said the guy we went to meet was a friend of his, and that this guy had more or less admitted that he met the people that shot my dad. And I was trying to get the media to focus on this, and that Adams had to have some information, and the story became about Ferris and Ellis then. And I went back to that journalist and I had a right pop on him, and I said, "You need to get me a doorstep with Adams. The next time Adams is doing a press conference," and he rang me the follow-up morning. He says, "You have a brilliant one." He says he's doing a press conference on Brexit this morning in it was one of the O'Callaghan hotels in Dublin. And he said, most of the media, the UK, Irish, and European media are all going to be there. I rocked up to the press conference, and it was in a kind of a library, and I pushed open the door. I was kind of late getting there. And Martin Kenny, he's now a TD, and I knew Martin from going to Glencree, doing the peace and reconciliation work in Glencree. And when he was a councillor, he was the Sinn Féin rep on that. He was standing behind the door, and I pushed in the door, and he kind of saw it was me, and he half-heartedly tried to push the door closed. And I gave it another yank, and I kind of sent Kenny a couple of feet across the door. I came in. I'm standing there, and there was a lot more media there than I thought would be there. And Adams was kind of caught like a rabbit in the headlights, and he looked and he didn't know what to say. And then he goes, "Oh, I'd like to welcome Austin Stack to the press conference." And at that stage, then I just said to him, I'd rehearsed what I was going to say. "Deputy, you are a liar. Deputy, you are a disgrace. Deputy Adams, you're this. Deputy Adams, you're that." Uh, and I said to him, "You need to take the information you have and go to the Gardaí with it." Then I just turned on my heels and walked out because I knew that if I had to stay there and let him respond, then his soundbite would be what the media would take. So I walked straight out, and all the media followed me out. And I gave an impromptu press conference out on the steps outside then. And it was my way of getting the lies he had told in the doll the previous day. It was my way of getting that truth back and bringing the story back. So like I would have no relationship with them now, even though I did try and do the right thing with them. They let me down by not. I mean, the easiest thing in the world for them to do. When myself and my brother Oliver, and I said it to Oliver after the first day we met with Adams. I said the easiest thing in the world for him to do is to come back. He said he'd call us after a month. Easiest thing in the world for them to do would have been to say, "Okay, Austin, we done a bit of checking on this, and the IRA are going to release a statement saying that they murdered your dad. End of. And apologize for the murder or whatever." But wouldn't that have been the easiest thing in the world for them to do? And it meant then that everything that happened after that wouldn't have happened. And it would have, I think, helped their political project. But for some reason, they decided to bring us on this rigmarole, going in a blacked out van to meet an IRA leader to give us a three-quarter truth. It just, like, tell the fucking truth. And just hold your hands up. There's nobody, like, they didn't have to put somebody in front of a press conference and say, "I'm the guy to pull the trigger." They just had to say, "Yes, we did this. Yes, it was an IRA operation. Yes, it shouldn't have happened." And that would have ended everything. But for some unknown reason, they didn't do that.
Um, Thank you very much now for everything you shared. Very, very personal story. Obviously, it can't be easy to keep dredging it up and going over it again and again. Just before we go, anything else you wanted to drop in or mention, or just kind of leave the listeners with?
No, I think everything is. I think we've covered most of everything that we need to do. But I would just say to your American listeners, that I do think that sometimes Irish American audiences need maybe a bit more nuanced about how they they um they take the troubles and to read both sides of the story and to kind of to listen to people like me as well as listening to the romanticized version of what happened.
Very good. I also in the past I've interviewed the son of a high up prison officer from the Maze prison. His name was Albert Miles. He was killed in '78. I interviewed his son Alan, who was actually there and pretty much saw it happen. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, it's very important to tell the stories of the victims and those who become victims through their loved ones being victims. Also, if anyone's interested in the similarities, I interviewed an ex-IRA man named Seamus Kearney, and he did like I guess in a way a similar journey to yours in that he was trying to find out information about his brother's murder. He was killed by the IRA after being falsely labeled an informant. So yeah, this idea of going back after the fact and trying to piece back together. Yeah, very important stories to tell. So th thank you very much. I'd recommend anyone do the book, the paper one, or the Audible like me, which you read. It was an excellent version.
Thanks very much, John.
Come on, thank you very much, Austin. Take care, mate.